Podcasters Roundtable round 118. I really wish I knew what I named it. Podcast stats, charts, other confusing info, right? There's just so much out there. And these days, there's like a ton of stuff coming out. Like the charts can be hacked. What the heck is a chart, anyways? Is there such a thing? Do you look at your stats? Do you hide your stats? We were just talking about that in the pre show, so we're going to get there. But let's meet the current roundtable. We'll grow a little bit here, but Anthony, welcome to your first roundtable.
Well, hello. Thank you for asking me to come on.
What is your show? Your podcast?
My main show is the Ritual Misery podcast. It is a look at military life, fatherhood, geekery, and gaming. We like to say that it is a celebration of two lifelong friends and their guests of all things geek, because as the name implies, everyone has a ritual misery, whether it's a car that you like to build and you just can't escape building that car, or the new tech you have to buy, or taking pictures of your kids. Everybody has something that they geek out about that they just cannot resist diving into every time they get a chance.
Yeah, I was going to say, I didn't decipher that from the topic, the name of your podcast, which I don't know if you've seen. I think it's the most recent or last two rounds we talked about what's going on with Apple, and they're yanking shows from or they're not accepting submissions where you sort of have to explain the title of your podcast, right? Which is, not necessarily bad, but people are stuffing them with keywords and all this stuff. So how do you get that across to your listener? I did go to your website and I saw it. So it's right there on the sidebar. It's nice that I can go there and be like, what is this about? And it's sort of bullet points, what's it about? But how do you convey all of that? Or do you care? Do you care if people find you through search or anything like that?
Search and SEO is such a tricky game to play that it's just, honestly, it's more fun just to record the podcast and have the experience of the podcast and the live chat room and the feedback that we get and things like that. So instead of worrying about how we're ranked necessarily and how people can find us, it's all through word of mouth and a little social group we have called Diamond Club that, we have a lot of people that follow us through there. And it's a lot more about having fun than it is about making sure that we're top ranked on any Google searches or anything like that. So we never really worried about the SEO aspect of it.
Cool. All right, Paul, welcome back.
Thank you. Is this T-shirt week? How does this work?
I'm not even going to count. I'm afraid to.
All right.
What's a podcast you'd like us to check out, Paul?
Oh, check out the podcast report. She's coming back. So summer hiatus will be over shortly, and gonna have some real fun.
You're a seasoned podcaster.
I'm a seasoned podcast, yes.
Hey, also seasoned podcaster.
Yes, exactly.
Paul tastes delicious after he's been marinated for a few hours.
Moving over to Libsyn Pro, so we're going to start doing some dynamic ad insertion and playing with that this season, so that should be fun.
Interesting. Well, I know you will have plenty to say about that. So this audience would care about that. So you definitely want to follow, and he'll let you know. Is it worth it? Because you're going to be paying more for that for sure.
Right? Yeah, a lot more.
Just a little. Okay, a lot more.
A lot.
Support Paul, patreon.com, whatever. All right. Hey, podcast stats. There was an article. So leading off here, James Cridlin wrote an article, former roundtabler. Once a roundtabler, always a roundtabler. I don't say former, but he wrote a how to understand podcast stats, and then I will put all these links in the show notes at podcastersroundtable.com. So important to check those out. You should be able to scroll up. Oh, maybe it's right there in your app as well. Of course, you're watching live on youtube.com/podcastersroundtable, so you don't see them yet, but you should be in the chat. Where's Dave? Dave is like in Australia. He usually puts links in the chat for us, but we'll survive. We'll survive one day while he's down under. But he wrote an article about how to understand podcast stats, and there's a lot of cool stuff in here. And it just goes to show why this kind of gets confusing. But right off the top, he talks about understanding the Apple podcast charts. And he says, while Apple, well, I don't think that's written right, but Apple does not publish the way they compile Apple podcast charts. So they don't let you know. They are generally understood to be based on recent subscriptions. Now, we were starting to talk about this in the pre-show as well. It was getting heated. I said save it. Yeah, right off the top. So it is based on subscriptions. When it comes to Apple, it's all about subs. What have you done for me lately, right? But I also thought I understood that. I thought Rob Walsh always talked about how it is also based on all-time subscriptions. This is why you see shows ranked above yours that have been dead for years, because they just either are getting subscribers over time and they've had so many, they're so far ahead of your show, even though you're current. So I understand. That's how I understand. How do you understand it, Paul?
Well, first of all, Rob and I agree that approximately 90% of your score is subs in the last 24 hours.
Right. Yes, it's the largest chunk. Exactly.
Yeah. So we agree on that. Where we disagree is where the other 10% goes.
Mm-hmm.
I have launched a couple dozen folk to number one, brand new out of the gate with no reviews, not asking for reviews.
But you're one of the hackers we're going to talk about later on.
Well, this is legit though. These are actual listeners.
Okay.
Now I've watched this, and I'll tell you, I've got some insight to this as well. But I mean, when you get a book author with 200,000 people on their mailing list, they can get 6,000-7,000 subscribers in 24 hours, no problem. It's not that hard to do. And so we agree that 90% of it's based on that. The other 10%, the question is, I've just seen people get to the top with no history, no comments, no downloads, no nothing other than the subs. So I'm closer to the other 10% is based on the subs as well. But again, this is the nature of the beast. We don't know for sure. I think if you look at the top subs or top subscribed shows, you're like, well, boy, this show was on NBC last night, or this show NPR played it or whatnot, so it makes a lot of sense. So my belief is it's closer to 95.
You're saying the top, meaning, I mean, they have those special feature boxes, right? Which is
no, I mean the ranking. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. I mean the chart rankings itself.
Okay, so I guess that's the other question. Is it a chart? Is there such thing as a chart? Really? I mean, it's not really telling us who the most downloaded, listened to podcast is. It has nothing to do with that.
Correct.
Right. So it's not really a chart, so to speak. It's a chart in Apple's world, but I don't even know if they're using it as a chart.
Part of my problem with the whole concept of this is we don't know how much of this is algorithm and how much is editorial based.
Right. That's what we talk a lot about with the new and noteworthy, where a lot of people say that's editorial, whereas I think there's like two of the, like, comedy and the front page are actual humans, I think, but the rest has to be algorithm. It doesn't, for all the drilled down subcategories.
Yeah, but I mean, even that, we don't know the algorithm. We don't, and Apple's not wrong in not letting us know exactly what it is in the algorithm, because then everybody's going to game it. But it should still be a sliding scale of something that we can actually tangibly take out of it versus just an arbitrary scale. Just arbitrary ranking. We don't know what we can get out of it, so everybody just throws things against it and hope that it works out.
Yeah, I think the question though about editorial though, I think I can help there, because I mean, we've taken people who 2 days ago weren't in iTunes, no history, no nothing, and we've taken them to number one. So there's no time for editorial. And I've launched a number, that have come, Apple's, hey, who are these guys? Is this legit? And they see the numbers and the IP addresses and they know it's legit. But just with what we've seen, I don't think editorial has time. I don't think editorial has the opportunity.
What can you give away? Because we know how to do that. I mean, it even says right here is launch a podcast, get your whole email list to subscribe within 24 hours. Yeah. Boom, you're number one, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's not complicated.
There's no more secrets.
Nope. No, it's really not. The thing you have to do though, let me give you the secret though. Podcasting's greatest strength is also one of its biggest problems, because the thing is, you can listen to a podcast anytime, any place, anywhere. And so if you go to your email list and say, hey, I've got a podcast that you can listen to anytime, any place, anywhere, it goes in that veritable to-do list. And what you have to do is, it is a 24-hour time period. I had one client who didn't believe me, and day one, it was her list, and then day two, it was her partner's, and she wanted to see how that would work. She didn't move between day one and day two, even though we had more clicks. So I know a good chunk of it is the 24 hours. So what you do have to do, the secret is, let them know, but then let them know that, hey, we're doing this Wednesday to go up the charts. We're doing this Thursday because we want Apple to take notice. And it's neat because if you have a list that likes you, if you have an audience that loves you, you can go to them and you can say, hey, come with me on this journey, be part of this. People love, I mean, this is the thing about podcasting. People love to be part of something they created. And so, if you can say, hey, help me come up the charts, let's do this together. People love that.
That's almost a bad omen for those of us that don't have an audience going into it, though, that are, slowly building an audience and kind of generating things, because the people with the big audience, it just scales it towards the big media again. And that's one of the problems with, well, some of us would say that's one of the problems with podcasting is if you got a
I'd say it's definitely one of the problems with podcasting.
Well, I would ask, does it matter? Like, I mean,
that's the second thing.
So what?
Yeah.
Like, oh, you're high up in the charts.
Right.
What does it really do for you? You've already got your base to listen to your podcast. How many more subscribers did you get from being in this magical place? And are they are they actual subscribers that you even want?
We were able to track one client who was able to get into a network. And when you have the networks, you get the stats of visits to the web page versus subscribes. And so we knew that, because we track clicks on the email, we knew that he got X amount of visits to the website or iTunes page. And so there were more people who came as a result. And so that was viable, but the numbers weren't that big at all.
Right.
Getting on somebody else's show is a lot better. And now, of course, with all the cheating that goes on, it doesn't really matter at all. The one thing that does happen, though, it's incidental, but the other people notice. And so when we run people up the charts, Spotify usually contacts and says, "Hey, how do we get these people on our list?" Or there's a podcast company who's swiping a lot of people right now, who's getting a pretty bad reputation. That they have reached out, and so you do get some attention by going up the charts, but only from the nerds. It's not real for building an audience at all. And I think to what Ray's, what Anthony's saying about it's not good for the little guy. It's not. But if you look at everything else in iTunes, I mean, we got shows in New and Notable that have been dead for 2 years.
Right.
So it's not like this is the only part that's not working.
Yeah. Well, I'm still looking at some of the other stuff here. We're going to talk about Chartable. It says understanding. There's PodTrack, right? There's another place you can get analytics or stats from, but that they don't have. You have to add that to yourself. So it's not a good. At least if you're going to look, I think PodTrack puts out like their top 20 podcasts, but they don't have all podcasts, right? So grain of salt, right? If you're measuring yourself, I'm not in the top 20. You may not be PodTrack.
So
yeah,
and especially if you're trying to compare yourself to others, you're not going to get the bigger names on there because, as we had talked about pre-show, hiding your numbers or not publicly saying your numbers is kind of a strategy of some podcasts and some networks. And
for what strategy? What do you think the strategy is to hide? This feels like something that's numbers close to the vest has been something podcasters have always kept close to the vest. I feel like, right?
Well, my perspective on it is if you're trying to say that you're the best network, but then someone can go through and quantify your downloads versus someone else, then they can dispute that claim, and it kind of makes you look foolish, even though your listeners are still going to be your listeners. And a lot of smaller podcasts, a lot of people that I know that podcast in the couple hundred downloads a week area, they're ashamed of it because they don't want to say their numbers until they're reaching hundreds of people a day, and getting those numbers up there. So it's something they can brag about. If they're not going to brag about it, then they're not going to say anything at all. And it seems to be, well, for us, we've never hidden our numbers. We've never, we get about 100 downloads a week on our show. We get a lot of interaction through back channels, and we get quite a few people watching live, but we're doing really well compared to some of our contemporaries in our social group for podcasts, and they're just astounded that we're releasing our numbers. And it's like, just why hold it close to your vest? Why not just say, this is what I'm getting, this is the real picture, this is how we're growing or we're not growing, or hey, we're looking for ideas to help grow. And it for our community, for our podcast, for my podcasts, it really just the community becomes more part of it, because then they feel more special that, hey, I'm not only do I listen to the show and know these people, but I also know some of the numbers behind it, and there's not a veil of secrecy anywhere in it.
Daniel, welcome to the show.
Hey guys.
Hey, nice to hear your voice. I will toss to you because I'm looking at part of this article here. This is the Pod News one about understanding podcast stats, and most podcast apps download a podcast automatically. So he's saying that using the difference between, back up, the difference between plays and downloads, right? So there are two different numbers, and I guess Spotify handles this, seems like in a good way, where they give you the number of downloads to the device, if they even do that. Do they do that? And then versus someone who presses play, because it's all in the box. It's a walled-in garden. They can tell you the difference, right? The same way that iTunes now gives you through Podcast Connect, gives you access to retention stats and stuff like that. They can tell when someone actually presses play via the app. But there's a difference here, right? Download numbers are not necessarily telling you everything, or not enough when you're looking at your stats. Let's see. It's because all podcast hosts measure downloads differently. He says, one, using the standard, they may describe themselves as IAB v2 compliant. Nice new jargonish acronym for us there. But
all those other guys are just one. You know, they're two.
V1. Are roughly comparable, those using that standard. We'll talk about that. But he said, but even these podcast hosts do not have identical measurement mechanisms. Excuse me. Ones that don't use the standard, most notably SoundCloud, may appear to give you 4 or 5 times the amount of downloads. They're not. They're just counting them differently. So when he says when you switch host, that's media host, you won't get the same numbers. So, you know, when you're looking at your numbers or you're giving numbers out to someone else, your numbers, if you're on a different host than someone else, are different, right? Because all these hosts. Now, so what is the IAB v2? Just IAB, this standard that was developing. Do we like this? Is this good? These standards? Is this something we needed?
It's the growing up of a standard that we've already had for many, many years. Years ago, there was the Association of Downloadable Media, ADM, that set many of the standards that were then followed by Podtrac, Libsyn, Blueberry, and several others. And IAB and IAB version 2 download measurement standards are then building on top of that. What defines a download? How much of the file has to be downloaded before it's counted a download? And things like IP addresses, whitelisting, blacklisting, how many devices do you count from a single IP address? Stuff like that. And some of that is new because when this first started, it wasn't common for a household to have 20 different IP addresses maybe downloading the same file through different or 20 different devices, that is, through the same IP address. That's much more common now with our smartphones. And like smartphones changing IP addresses when they're on mobile networks versus Wi-Fi. So some stuff has changed over the years, and that's why there's been this revision and this growth, this maturing of the standard that we've already had.
Does these IAB ones, so like Libsyn, Blueberry, anyone's using these, do they break out the difference between, because most apps are not reporting back plays, right? So there is, I thought there was something in the standard. No, it doesn't, right? You don't know. We don't know if
not the IAB standard. Yeah,
it's downloads. It's just downloads, right? You don't know plays.
And for people who sell CPM, real downloads are what you want to track. So IAB is great, and IAB 2 and one day IAB 3, you know, are great for those people who want to track how many downloads for those who sell CPM.
Yeah, which is none of us. Well, maybe Paul, but
no.
CPM, not the best model for most, I would say most podcasters. But, you know, we saw, I guess, with these IAB compliant stats, a lot of systems changed over, and it's a little more strict in a good way. You didn't lose audience. You had the same audience as you did before. It's just being reported more accurately. In theory, we hope. It's a better measurement. So, you know, I think I was reading an article by Jessica Kufferman. I think that's how you say it. And she was talking about how, you know, if you had a sponsor before and your numbers went down, your influence, your reach, it's all the same, right? Like you don't have to worry about necessarily a sponsor pulling out because, oh, your numbers are down in that case, because shouldn't be selling your numbers. You should be selling the value that you actually give to that audience. It's the same audience as before. So, you know, do you guys look at your stats? I mean, we've talked about this before. I don't look at my stats anymore, but when you start, you surely do. Paul looks at stats because he has clients probably. So I don't know, Paul, I would say I don't look at stats very much, but most of what I'm doing, I would categorize as hobby, but you probably focus on stats, right?
Yeah. Well, but the stats we look at are not necessarily the downloads. We can take 4 episodes of a show. We can see episode 1 got consumed 80%. Episode 2 got consumed 10%. We know that do more episodes like episode 1. That's really viable. And then if you're doing some sort of call to action in the show, selling something or email newsletter or whatever, if the average person consumed to 40% and you made the offer at 60%, you didn't build your show right. And so a lot of times we look at the stats to determine how the show is built, and then flip side, if we're getting newsletters or we're selling something, downloads is some metric, but again, 5,000 downloads of people who only listen for 2 minutes is a lot more telling than anything else.
So if you want less than 2-minute downloads, you go to Facebook, right?
Well, that's a whole other issue.
We'll talk about that. We have some information related to that as well that Paul dug in. Go ahead.
No, I can tell you that as a hobbyist myself, we don't have any commercial interest in podcasting, but for a while there, it was looking at the numbers and stressing over it, and now it's kind of looking at the numbers as a trend. Are we losing some audience over the last 6 months or so? And so it's gone from first couple episodes I was checking them every single day, and now here I am 4 years later, several hundred episodes later, looking at, well, this is what the trend has been for the last 6 months on this show. The live numbers, the overall downloads, and how many people were getting interact. I would rather have actually a really strong chat presence, because it shows that people really care and they're right there in your face and they're interacting, and half the time they're providing content while you're doing the show. So I think it's a growing up process not to pay attention to the numbers as much, but I'm still curious. I've been doing this for a couple of years, not nearly as long as you guys have, but when is it that turns off, and when does it become important again? When do you really need to worry about the numbers? Do you ever really need to worry about them unless you're selling ads?
Maybe not even if you're selling ads. Theory.
Well, you can use it for leverage for other things. If you want to get press access or interview a celebrity or something like that, then it's nicer to be able to say, hey, we've got an audience of this many hundred or this many thousand or whatever it is. But the number itself, I think your download number itself is probably one of the least important numbers that you could look at for your stats. Just that raw number, because it doesn't really tell you the full picture.
Right. And I mean, back to what are you selling, right? Like if you have 200 Cadillac dealers and that's who you're selling Cadillacs and that's who you're talking to, then, I'm going to a trade show for Cadillac, but this other show is a car show. It's a general car show. They don't really know who they're talking to, but they have 1,000 listeners. I mean, what are you selling, right? You're selling Target at that point. I think that's what's most important. I don't think the numbers matter. If you know how to explain that value to the advertiser, in theory, if you can explain why a low number can be really powerful, if in your case, you know who your audience is, I think that's more important, right? Probably if you spend time knowing who your audience is as much as you are obsessing about how many of them are, it's probably going to help you out a lot, right? So I don't know. I just launched some surveys at work. We hadn't done this for years and years, but trying to figure out who exactly are we talking to, because I think you'll definitely be surprised. You'll assume who you're talking to. I assume we're talking to podcast producers right now. We're probably talking to a lot of people who have thought about starting a podcast, but they're not necessarily podcasters. They're waiting around. So the information could be or should be a little different for them. So knowing who your audience is, I think most of the time sounds bad, but you're selling your audience. You're selling the focus of that audience.
Yeah.
Well, and that raw download number doesn't give you a whole lot that can actually affect your podcast other than some of those few opportunities. But if you instead look at your engagement numbers, that can tell you stuff about
what are your engagement numbers, because that engagement is harder to track. What do you mean by engagement numbers?
You could measure it in different ways. It could be how many people take action on something you mentioned, how many people purchase something from you.
Okay, so not something that we by default as podcasters have. Okay, so because I was thinking, go to Podcast Connect and see your retention rates maybe
Well,
that's a brief insight to what every podcaster in theory has engagement to. But beyond that, engagement is really hard to measure. Feedback, right? Maybe.
yeah, yeah, and anyone can have some kind of engagement with their podcast. The feedback, the shares, stuff like that. The things that you get from Podcast Connect, seeing your consumption analytics, that can help you make decisions about your episodes. Like Paul was saying, if you see that your audience only listened to a small portion of an episode, it will count as a download. And it may even count as a complete download. But if they only listen to the first 2 minutes of an hour-long episode, you'll discover that there's some kind of problem you need to fix with your podcast. If you see your download numbers spike for a particular episode, that's not necessarily because of the content of that episode. It could be because of your marketing of that episode. It could be purely because of the title of that episode that it gets downloaded so much. And that's the case like with some of the fake video experiments that I've done in years past, that I saw massive views on a video based on its title, but then extremely low audience retention based on the content. So these special consumption analytics that we're getting from Apple, from Spotify, from Stitcher, from maybe some other players in the space at some point, those are a lot more valuable, not for knowing the size of your audience, but for helping you make better decisions about how to do your podcast. And I think that's the whole purpose of stats, really.
And Anthony, as you kind of your question, I think if your numbers start falling, that might be a good time to a good reason to track and a good time to start worrying, right? I mean, because that's one indicator. Like if your podcasts tend to grow over time, grow slowly, I would say the majority of podcasts. But if it goes the other way, you should be paying attention to at least that. It's kind of like monitoring your own audio. Like you should do that so you can catch the problems when they happen, ideally.
Right.
And I mean, taking a look at your stats once in a while to make sure you haven't fallen off a shelf for some reason. Maybe you got the privilege of being taken out of Apple iTunes because you put one too many keywords or a colon or a bar. And oh my gosh, there could be reasons. There could be something actually wrong with your podcast. Like it's gone. Although, is it really gone at that point? If all your subscribers, you get kicked out of the Apple Podcast Store, Daniel, are you cut off from your subscribers?
I'm hesitating for a reason, because it used to be that the answer was a completely straight no.
Yeah, you're connected to them via your feed, right?
Well,
what if they're using podcast app and you're kicked out?
The thing I want to know now is in some of the testing and stuff that I've looked at, and some of the people have known this for a while, that in the new podcast app, when someone subscribes to your podcast, the RSS feed that they're actually hitting is that redirect feed that you can see inside of your Podcast Connect account for your podcast.
This mirror URL?
Yeah, the mirror URL, which follows a basic URL formula that is simply your iTunes ID along with their mirror URL field. And that's a 302 temporary feed redirect. So if someone new subscribes to your podcast today in Apple Podcasts, they hit that RSS feed first. So the reason I bring that up is it makes me wonder, well, what happens if Apple removes your podcast from Apple Podcasts for whatever reason? Do they also break those mirror URLs? If they do, then yes, you're disconnected from your audience.
Yeah, that sucks.
But I don't think they do, because that iTunes ID number that the podcast get stays unless you have to resubmit your podcast with a new RSS feed or something like that. So even if your podcast is disabled, that ID number is still attached to your podcast. So I don't think it would break it, but it's possible they could.
Paul, you looked like you were both interested in the answer, but also maybe had some thoughts. No extra insight, right?
Well, I'll give you one thing. I got a client who spends over $1 million in Facebook ads. He's willing to spend $1 million a year in Facebook ads. He's willing to buy an audience, whatever way makes sense. So we did Overcast FM ads. and we did it in his category. And we tracked the increase of Overcast FM downloads during the course of that ad buy. And it was really good. And subscribes were good, numbers were up. And when we left, the numbers were still there. They weren't only running during that time. So that was very, very cool. And it did so well that he asked, well, should we leave the category? Should we just go run a site? It was about twice the price, but they promised 3 or 4 times the views. So we run a site, and we were able to basically determine that he was actually getting less, from run of site than he was getting absolutely targeted, because of the downloads that were coming to Overcast. So in some cases, it's a really good idea to track what's going. If you get on the Audacity to podcast, you want to be able to track what your download delta is between that last week and this week, with all the people that is brought to your show as a result. So you want to use your stats to check what's working, and then the thing that Daniel said about the whole, you might be in it for whatever. Again, if your offer is 60% into the show and everybody stops listening 50% in the show, it doesn't matter how many downloads you get. You got to fix the show. So each stat has a different option to it, has a different thing to it. You just got to kind of put the whole thing together. But the big thing is, what do you want? If you're there just to figure out who you are and have fun with some friends, and that's great. If you're trying to sell a product or a service, that's great. If you're, if you want to get to that third ad insert so that you can get 120 CPM for your show, then you got to build a show that gets to that third ad insert. What's your goal? Do the stats support it? And then you go from there.
What were you saying there about being able to track, like if I go on Daniel's show and I'm trying to figure out, is the traffic coming from being on that show?
Well, it's just the delta. If my average download on a Wednesday night is 50 episodes, I go in Daniel's show and there's 250 downloads that day, and that's the only difference. That's really, really interesting.
Right.
Gotcha. We had one client. We got one client on Libsyn Pro. He's got 3 different shows, and anytime we do an insert for show 1 where he talks about show 2, even though there's no tracking, there's no nothing. Whenever he inserts, we get about 2,500 downloads of that episode that we can't account for anywhere else. I mean, they are. You always see release day, release day. And, we always do the positioning on a day that's not a traditional release day. And so at least you see trends. Yeah, sure. That could have been the day that Libsyn screwed up, or that could have been the day that the Apple Watch podcast update gave everybody those downloads. But you do it enough time, you can begin to see trends, and then you just know what works.
Right. Yep. Important to pay attention. There's so many ways. I don't know. What do we need from stats? So are we getting enough out of stats? Paul, since you are tracking for clients, are you getting everything you want from stats?
I tend to look at things differently. I tend to be like, what do we have and what can we get from it? I'm not one of these ones that goes on and complains. Once they started giving us consumption inside iTunes, that was the game changer for me. That was the thing that I wanted more than anything else.
What are you
and it's
doing
funny because I've gone to clients and I've said, one client, what do you think was your best episode this month? What do you think was your worst episode this month? And believe it or not, they were reversed. The one that he thought was the best was the least consumed. The one he thought was the worst was the most consumed. And that kind of data is really, really powerful. I think another piece of data, we looked at a client at his September downloads, and his September downloads, only 23% of them were August and September content. Everything else was archival. The stuff and that's really, really key. This idea that we think we're building a show for this week when, 67% of his audience was more than 60 days out. That gives us a real insight into who his audience is and what we can do about that. And, pays for the dynamic ad insertion.
It's funny because 2 days ago, apparently, as I'm looking at my Twitter, I tweeted this out sort of just haphazardly. I just tweeted out as I was thinking of it. Let me know what you guys think. I said, trying to determine an outlier in an episode's stats, it would be really helpful if in Podcasts Connect, I could search the popularity of keywords. Example, how many times people search for a term inside iTunes or Apple Podcast. I said, one can dream. Because we have a spike, which Rob Walsh would not call a spike, but a definitely difference coming from somewhere. We have an episode that's downloaded, I guess you could say, twice as many as any other. And that's a couple thousand downloads. I want to know how that happened. So I'm trying to figure. So I'm going what's the so I'm social hacking it. Is that what that's called when you socially engineer, whatever. I'm trying to figure out. I'm asking people, did you share this? Did you embed it? Did you post it? Did you tweet it? But it could be like Dan, you're saying, it could be title, right? People could just be finding this title, attracted to this title, whatever it is. It would be really cool if in Podcast Connect they could see sort of like a Google, just to track keywords, like what's popular today, or how many times is this keyword searched in Apple Podcasts. I'd like that. Do you think that would be useful?
It would be extremely useful. But again, the problem is it's going to be reverse engineered, and then people are going to start, putting podcast in with those titles. My prediction is you're going to, you can buy keyword terms in the App Store now. And so you can reverse engineer what people are searching for in the App Store, at least based on how many times your ad pops up. That's coming to iTunes, and you're going to be able to do that. And then I think at that point, people will buy terms just to find out how many times those are viewed a day and do the reverse engineering.
But Google, I mean, this has been something that's existed forever, right? But Google somehow
inside of Google, yeah. But podcast is podcast search the same as Google search, the same as YouTube search? I mean, this is the big question that everyone wants to know. And Apple's keeping that pretty clean. Now, Overcast, I think, probably has some pretty good stats as well. But Overcast is, of course, they're the aggressive power user audience, which is fantastic. But man, to know what people are searching for, just from a service standpoint, I mean, in podcast about podcasting, wouldn't it be great if we knew that this was the term that everybody was looking for? I think there's a little bit of just, I want to serve my audience, and if they're looking for this, let's produce a show about it.
Yeah, I mean, YouTube, this works really well.
What if things like that were presented in the aggregate instead of by episode or by day or whatever else? If it was like, hey, Apple came out with this yearly report on this is what people are searching for in the App Store this year, and didn't provide any other detail, at least it'd give us a clue to go into without giving us too much information to hack with. Like there's other ways of giving us the information that we need and we want to push this forward without giving us something that we can immediately game the system with.
Right. And that's what I figured Google, YouTube, these companies have to have this figured out, right? So, I mean, can you ask? Can Apple just post an engineer for like a feature that I want?
I came back from Vid Summit last week. I don't know if you're familiar with that event. Daryl Eves puts it on. Daryl is one of the best in the industry.
Daryl, good friend of the show. No, I don't know. I've met him.
Daryl's amazing. And the cool thing is Daryl can stand on stage and go, last year, my clients got 26 billion earned views. Do you want to see what the stats are? And Daryl was able to show, and when you have 26 billion entries to play from, you can actually speak with authority. He was able to show that, hey, shows with swearing get less ads, get less CPM, and we know that YouTube, all things being equal, will play a show with an ad. So, if you want to get seen more, take out the swearing. YouTube, all things being equal, if a show gets a 10-second view and another show gets a 5-second view, YouTube will send people to the 10-second view because that's a better experience for YouTube. And this is where I think Apple could jump into play. If Apple knows that Daniel's show gets 3 times the consumption mine does, then it's due to Apple to put his show before mine. And that's where I think we could serve people better right now. And if we actually based search and charting based on consumption, as opposed to how many Bangladeshian servers can hit a subscribe button in 5 seconds, we could have an entirely different game. And that's where Apple could use these stats to really, I mean, they know when people subscribe, they know when people unsubscribe, they know how much they consume. They could build a psychometric for what people are actually consuming, do search on that and whatnot, and really just raise the game in some ways that have never been raised before. YouTube's doing it. Facebook, who knows what they're up to? The news this week has been fascinating, but Apple could do this. And if you look at what Apple's doing right now, there are some areas that they are completely ignoring. The desktop is ignored. I mean, it's just ignored. Yet, one interesting thing, I don't know if anybody's noticed this or it's just me, they don't distinguish between audio and video podcast anymore on the iOS devices or on the Apple TV. So there's some places where Apple's definitely going. There's some places that Apple's definitely ignoring, but they have the opportunity to look at the stats and provide a better experience for our audience.
I think that's the direction they're going to go too, because that's a good way to fix this problem too. If people get in the system by systematically subscribing to podcasts, you measure it on the actual consumption, and that's although subscriptions are the currency of podcasts, consumption is really the value.
Well, currency. So I'm going to challenge that statement. I understand the spirit of that statement, but I got a fun one for you. I want to be careful with this. I was able to monitor the results of someone who went up the charts through Bangladeshian means, if you will. And here's the thing. It's not downloads. It was purely subscribes. It was subscribe and then get out before you could even download. So straight up the charts with no impact at all on downloads. Not they downloaded and they didn't listen, but no impact at all on downloads, and just went like this, through the roof because of subscription. So all Apple has to do is just stop solely on that metric. Go solely, go to consumption, which they have, if they would just track it, and then they could be at a better place. So subscription is the currency currently, but it's not, it's not the real currency because, anyway.
Then we're just going to turn into Bitcoin, where all these servers just listen to podcasts. Just you subscribe, download, and just press play, my friend. It's just a little bigger script. That's all. I don't know how that works.
But the nice thing about that is that makes it much more expensive to try to gain.
That is nice.
And
Bitcoin,
so
my issue.
Instead of 5,
and you melt the earth.
So with all this being said, with the numbers being essentially not useful, and people being able to pay to get their rankings up on the faux charts that Apple and everyone else has, is consumption the real thing that we need to do? And are we just waiting for someone to standardize the way to report the consumption so that the apps and the services can all go by the same metric? Is that really what we need to strive for?
It's the metric that excites me the most, because it's a metric of service. I mean, are they actually listening to this show? I mean, we've been going now for how long on this episode? Did everybody, download this thing and go, hey, it's Paul, I'm out of here and we're done? I mean, let's, consumption.
We'll
is
know
the metric
based
of
on,
service.
we'll know if they want to stare at us for this long, because YouTube's going to tell us, right?
Exactly.
Well, and that's just it. Who should be the one to develop that standard so the podcasts have similar tracking as YouTube? And is there a single person that can do it, or a single entity that can do it? And is there a single entity that should do it? And how do we, as a community of podcasters, how can we kind of pressure that decision matrix down the line a little bit to kind of get this going? Is there a way? Is there a path from here to there?
I think the IAB, it clearly seems like has become, I'm seeing it referenced everywhere as a standard.
Right.
I mean,
but not for consumption. IAB is truly what's a real download.
I know, but I'm saying if there's anyone to push, like, I think
true.
That's the vehicle. Like, it feels like that's the way. I feel like they're going to lead this standardization. And so that's where we have to go to, right? And we don't have the money.
I think Apple has a unique chance. I think if Apple
doesn't care about podcasts. That's what I've heard recently. Like, they don't care about us, right? They don't.
They care about selling iPhones and Apple TVs and iPads.
Right.
The problem with Apple is they don't care about sharing their information with other people. So if it's going to be an industry standard, something that everyone can use and feed into and pull from, Apple isn't going to want to take part in that unless they're forced to, because that's just Apple's way.
Well, yes and no. Like straight stats are there, but the thing is, if I want to know what podcast is the best podcast in the how to podcast space, and Apple lists the podcast about podcasting in order of what actually serves the audience the most, I can go, my God, Daniel's king, and Dave Jackson's a joker, and now I know who to model and I know who to emulate. And so Apple won't necessarily give us those straight numbers, but if their results actually showed it, I mean, that's what you do in YouTube now. I mean, you want to find out who is the best video for a certain term, search that term, watch that video, see what they did, and emulate it. I think
that's kind of, that leads to something I don't like, and it's crushes creativity. Like, you can be better than that person if you find out a new way that, what I mean? If you bring yourself to it. Like, I don't want to see repeats. We're going to see everyone copies stuff that's good. And that's not necessarily bad to be motivated by it, but to be doing it to get more audience bugs me, because, especially with podcasting, there are no damn rules. And I've always said I want to see what the kids come up with. Show me something different, man. And if it is really that good, it will pass that already established model of good. So yes and no, I guess, is where I'm at.
I hear you.
It's
I hear you.
not bad, but I think the problem is, I don't know. There's always a problem when we're trying to figure out how to, it's a fine line between growing as a creator, right? Learning, getting better, and then doing it just for numbers or popularity, right?
Absolutely.
So that's a tough.
But even on that, I mean, even like your hobbyist that doesn't care about numbers at all and is never going to sell anything or really try to develop a huge audience of any sort. As creatives, we seek validation, external validation. Like it's one thing to be a great painter and look at your own painting and go, that's pretty nice. But as creatives, we like to hear that other people are enjoying the things that we're creating. So there's always going to be that balance of, the numbers don't matter, but they matter.
Right. I mean, and when you do want to reach the people who want to hear it, right? You're like, I do this certain kind of comedy, or I do a video channel about gear, and I want to make sure I get in front of the people who want to consume it. Right. That's the thing, right? There's a balance between getting in front of your actual audience and then just being like, I just want to be popular, right?
Yeah.
And
it's tough. A lot of my favorite YouTube videos, in fact, since we're kind of showing that parallel a little bit, are the people like the Vlog Brothers. I loved watching them in the beginning because they were doing something new and different, and it was twice a week, and it was two different perspectives, and sometimes it bounced off each other. Like that wasn't there, and then all of a sudden there's tons of them, and I don't watch it anymore because it's just not. It doesn't spark anything. I watch a lot of photographers, and you see Peter McKinnon is kind of like my favorite right now, and you're watching him, and his videos are kind of the same thing everyone else is doing, but with a little bit a different flair, and it keeps my interest. And that's what I'm looking for in podcasts too. Is I want the same thing that everybody's trying to do, but do it in your own way, and that's always the hard thing to find and search for, and especially when you have charts, but they don't actually mean what you think they mean, and there's no way of really finding the things on a scale of any sort of what else you might be interested in. And I'm glad there's finally some sites out there that are trying to cross-reference and index and be the IMDb of podcasting, so you can kind of see where the links are and what else you might be interested in. But that's just a big void right there in the middle as well, is the natural discovery from one if you're a listener or a viewer of podcasts and you're trying to find something similar to what you're listening to, then you really just go and chase down the other people on that show and see what else they're into. And it's really a manual process. There's no algorithmic way of doing it because these charts don't really mean anything.
Yeah, YouTube does a great job at putting stuff in front of me that I haven't seen that I want to see. And I think the problem with podcasts is you don't have slow motion and B-roll, Anthony. I mean, it's a Peter McKinnon joke, but
yeah. One of the stats though last week, speaking to what you just said though here, and boy, you want to talk about discovery and podcasting. One of the stats for Vid Summit last week was 70% of all views at YouTube are recommended videos.
Yeah, that's what I mean. They do a great job. That's me. Yeah. I'm clicking them because they're relevant.
Yeah. Who in this room would like to have 70% of their views coming from or listens coming from Apple recommending, if you'd like this, you'd like this.
Yeah, and that might actually feed into the theory that the top and the new and noteworthy actually means something, because on YouTube it sure does. When YouTube shows something in front of you, everybody wants to click on it. But
that's a different metric.
No one sees new and noteworthy. I mean, like, and I've always said that when you had to go to the iTunes store and it was a nice big desktop image and you could see all the other podcasts, I subscribed to them all. When other people were listening to this, because it was just there. I was like, yep, that title, yep, that title, yep. Another hard part about podcasts is you can't easily sample a podcast. It's just harder. I don't know, even if YouTube is, I mean, in theory, YouTube is equally hard. You still have to watch a little bit, but something about even being visual, you almost know immediately, yeah, I'm either in or I'm out. I don't know what it is, but it is hard to sample podcasts. That makes that part of it harder. But letting us know what other people who listen to that show also are listening to is huge. And I think, Daniel, didn't you say they are doing this in the app, right? Podcast app. I just don't think it's in your face enough. I mean, besides, when you're looking at a YouTube video, you're staring at a screen, right? When you pick up your podcast, you press play, it goes back in your pocket and you're out of there. You're not looking at
And
the screen.
even on YouTube, it often will automatically jump to a related video.
Yeah,
or
if you
another
leave,
video
if you stop
from
paying
that.
attention, it'll jump.
Yeah. Well, and it is more in front of your face in the Apple Podcasts app on iOS, because now with iOS 11, since iOS 11, they brought those people also listen to recommendations into your library. So if you scroll down all the way to the bottom
All
of a
the way to the
podcast you're
bottom.
already subscribed to, yeah, it's listed there. Yeah,
Yeah.
I know. It's all the way at the bottom, but that is much more visibility than it had before.
Apple's been watching the Roundtable. It's clear. And I'm
Oh, yeah.
watching, I mean listening. It's very
Call me.
clear.
Call me.
I've been I told them that a long time.
And the other thing is, like, I had to question some of that stuff, because every time I see a podcast that is recommended to me, it recommends something that I know I'm not going to like. Like if I get recommended the Joe Rogan podcast one more time, I might delete that app. You know, it's just like, I don't like that show. I like others like it, but that one doesn't spark me at all. But it's on every recommendation that I've, if there's two guys talking, Joe Rogan is on there as the next recommendation. It's like, come on, there's more out there than just one or two of these.
And ideally it would take into, I guess we could, like, this in theory could be a privacy issue, but I'm sure it's how YouTube does it. It also plays into what you are consuming currently, right? You're like, he's never clicked on Joe Rogan. Like, it's just like, we'll stop serving that. But he's listening to these others, and you can establish a sort of profile of what you might like. It's an engine they need to do better on, I'm sure. But again,
Google Podcasts is trying to make that.
Right. And we've heard the long awaited Pandora has got their special algorithm, which I think the idea there is Pandora is great. I actually just finally started premium after just years and years of saying I'm not going to do it. I knew I would eventually. I started it. It's fantastic because I can skip, but I don't get affiliate income, so don't do anything with that. But Pandora is fantastic because it goes back to that sampling issue where within a couple seconds, I'm like, nope, yep, nope, thumbs up, thumbs down, right? That doesn't work with podcasting. You can't, don't start playing a podcast next. First of all, I just listened to a podcast for 45 minutes. I've probably arrived at my destination and I'm done. But if you're going to shuffle podcasts, I don't see that working.
Well, it's long form content. Generally, podcasts are long form content. So you look at other long form content like books or movies, and there is no sampling out there, really. There are trailers. Yes, you could say that's kind of a sample, and
that does work good for movies.
Yeah, and that works, and people get hyped about a movie often from its trailer. And there's a lot of marketing that goes into the movie, but their whole goal is get you to watch or buy that movie. But that's one thing. That's not necessarily a series. So then you could consider, well, what about book series or TV series? And again, it's the marketing, what other people are saying, what your friends are saying, where is it being promoted in other places? But it's not any kind of automated thing. Now, there are sites out there that try to match you with your ideal movie. Like you enter into it. If you like this movie, then you'll probably also like these other movies. That's good. A recommendation engine, which I've used a dozen times in my life.
People don't use that. That's the population as a whole is not really going to use that thing, right? It has to be. I mean, Apple has the lockdown on consumption in an app. I mean, if you're
you got to think there's two. Well, first of all, Overcast. I poo-pooed the Overcast ads for the longest time because the whole demographic of Overcast users, they're the power users. These are the people who have the religion. These are the people who know the shows they want. So I ever thought, like, why in the world would I ever advertise to them? But the numbers are real. It's been fantastic. And I think what Overcast has showed independently is that people who do have the religion are looking for better shows. So, if I'm in a business, let's see who's in business, and advertising there really makes sense, or the Twitter friends make sense. But for the Pandora thing, I want to suggest, going back to a little bit of what's his face from Edison, Tom Webster. Tom's whole thing that, we got two types of people who have the religion, people who don't. More people use Pandora every month than listen to podcast every month. And this is a group who's used to saying, I like 80s music, show me something.
Right.
And I think a world where we say, I'm into nerd culture, show me something. Not really, that one wouldn't work, but like, I'm into travel, let me listen to something. I'm into business, let me listen to something. I'm into left or right politics, let me listen to something. I think Pandora could be a discovery mechanism, the likes of which we haven't seen before. Because, we've all had that friend who's like, what kind of podcast is there for me? We all do the Daniel thing of what's your favorite TV show, but the whole world of what people are into is a lot more than that. And I'll tell you something, this is where Pandora could win. And Pandora, call me. Pandora could serve, 1,000 times every politics show to people who say they're interested in politics, see how soon they clip out. So send 1,000 here, send 1,000 here, send 1,000 here, send 1,000 here, and then realize that show number 3 is getting 3 times the consumption of all the other shows. Like, this is where the power of this can really come to play. And so, yes, I agree with the idea that, like, I'm 45 minutes, I'm done, but that's for us, that's for the power user. But for somebody who's like, I just want something better than drive time radio, there's nobody better than Pandora to bring it to you, especially if you just go, I like comedy, I like business, I like travel.
Yeah. And I think you're right.
That's the opportunity.
I think the idea of saying I like these things, maybe put your interest in, and it shows you something. Because I think we've seen on surveys, I think a lot of people say, well, I don't think there's anything for me, or I don't know what to listen to, right? I don't know what podcast to listen to. Like, if someone doesn't tell me. So being able to go into a system like that, and again, you probably already are, those people are more likely to have Pandora, and Pandora will have a major push and be like, hey, just like music, enter genre, and we'll present you with content you might like. So I think in that way, it could work for the less power user, a non-power user, even a power user, obviously.
Yeah. No power users, but there's a lot of people who are not power users. And
right. Well, we want those people. We want everyone, right? I mean, that's the point. We need to grow listenership beyond people who are already listening.
But where this becomes a big problem is that's siloing the solution. So maybe Pandora comes up with the perfect solution. It only applies to people who listen to podcasts through Pandora. It doesn't work in the other 99.9%.
But that puts pressure on those other platforms to build something like it. I mean, if it's going to be profits, right? If Pandora finds out, holy cow, this works like gangbusters, other company, Apple's going to be like, I mean, if you're Instagram, you just steal it, right? I mean, like, you see this. Stories, Snapchat, sure, we just do that. So, please find something that really works well. I'm guaranteed these other companies will figure out how to implement it.
Is there opportunity, Daniel? Let's say they do this, okay? And let's say they've finally brought the discovery engine that podcasters have been asking for forever, okay? Could the podcaster then introduce other vehicles to consume podcast with? Could they bring up Overcast? Could they bring up some of the other channels and talk about that for people who didn't even know that was an option?
I think that starts putting unnecessary burden on the audience when you start saying, hey, you should try out this other podcast app, when your audience is probably thinking, and your audience of just a casual podcast listener, not the podcasters out there who are listening, but they're thinking, why should I do that? I already have an app that works.
I'm not moving apps. Yeah. You can forget that idea. Yeah. I missed out a little bit looking at the chat, but if it's about moving people to apps.
But I do think there is something that the podcaster can do, and that is to be the Pandora for their audience, to say, if you like our show, you might also like such and such. But that gets into an area where I think there are two sides of conflict that podcasters face with that. One is the competition perspective, where podcasters can often feel competitive to say, I don't want to recommend my competition. I don't want to say, hey, if you like the Audacity to Podcast, you should also listen to School of Podcasting or the Podcast Report or whatever. But the other aspect, so even if you make it past that competition perspective, the other aspect, and this is especially among the podcasts that have a massive following, is they only want to promote their stuff, their own network. So and this is the big fault of my own podcast network, is that it's too diverse. So I can't really say in the Audacity to Podcast, hey, if you like the Audacity to Podcast, listen to our podcast about a TV show.
Right.
It's that major disconnect. It's why? Well, okay, maybe if you like me, so I could just say, hey, if you love me, I host another podcast. And certainly, yes, people will follow that kind of thing. But I think it's more important to recommend those kinds of podcasts to your audience. And sometimes you have to be the better man or the better woman to stand above self-promotion and stand above the competitive attitudes and just serve your audience better.
Well, I think that, and that's part of it is like, it's what's the motivation, right? I'm getting big old feedback here. Hold on. I'm going to loop here myself. Mix mine has gone bad. I don't know what's going on. You podcasters say, what's the motivation for me to do that, right? And I mean, I think at some point you have to, it's kind of like selling the value of downloads versus listens versus your audience. In, you know, by growing the space, you'll bring more people into podcasting and hopefully that'll come back to you. But that's a hard thing to do, to spend your time doing that on an episode of your own show. I mean, we get it in this space because I'm going to tell people, hey, Paul covered this thing, go check out Podcast Report. And, you know, I'm going to introduce my audience to him, and it goes back and forth. But I think most podcasters wouldn't see the value in growing the space as it is. I think you said serving your audience, right? I mean, making your audience happy, being like, oh my gosh, you introduced me to another great show. I'm not going to listen to yours anymore, but I have time for that one. I'm kidding. That's a joke, but I don't know. We've already jumped off. I feel like we've kind of hit on. We didn't need to dive into other stories here because we have the rotten Apple podcast charts. They're being gamed, right? We know that. Blah blah. Whatever. Is there any more there anyone wants to cover? Man, we've sort of hit on that. We've hinted at the Chartable thing, right? Daniel, do you have that story on here, Chartable? What do you want to say about that?
Yeah, it's the same thing about the people who are gaming the system. And Apple does seem to be taking action. Maybe it's only, though, when it's pointed out to them, hey, this podcast looks like it's gaming the system. Maybe they have something now that red flags a podcast when it seems to be like a nobody podcast suddenly making it into the top charts. And maybe they're tweaking their algorithms. I don't know, but I'm sure that because Apple is so focused on the user experience, sometimes I would say even to the detriment of the creator's experience, but because they're so focused on that user experience, I expect they're going to fix this problem.
And that seems like a tough one, right? A seemingly nobody comes out of nowhere. There are so many people that have massive audiences that we wouldn't really know about. So I guess they're probably seeing, oh, these are subs with no downloads or no plays, kind of like what Paul was saying, right? I mean, I would imagine that's what's going on here. Isn't that what's going on? I didn't read the article. Is that how these are being gamed? People are popping up? It has to be. We established its subscribers over like last 24 hours, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
In fact, I've got an ongoing dialogue with someone through Facebook who, Rakesh Hamadanen or whatever from some overseas country, not his real name. And he's been offering to help me promote my podcast. And so I've been just exchanging this dialogue with this scammer. And I've gotten names of podcasts he's helped. He's told me some of his clients. So now I know, oh, okay, those podcasters gamed the system. And only $1,000.
Or did he really help them? How do you know he's a scammer? Or does he? Maybe he's just good. I mean, Paul will do it for you, and he's good.
Well, see, if I asked Paul a question like, Paul, you say you're going to help my podcast rank better. How would you do that? What would Paul's answer be?
Well, we have a huge network of people who would love to listen to your No, I'd say Apple charts are based on subscribes. Let's get you as many subscribes as we can in 24 hours and bring you up the charts.
And then your approach to that, I'll answer kind of this for you, would be to find actual people to actually subscribe. They subscribe. Right. My ideal
and the first question I'd have you is, do you have a list? Do you have a following? Do you have a whatnot? And then if you say no, I go, yeah, charting is not a strategy for you. And we have a lot of people that charting is not a strategy for. I've got a client right now who has 1 million active users, 1 million active users on their email list right now. You know, when they launch their show, they're going to be a #1 podcast, period. You know, but legitimately, even if their content sucks, you know, and we're making the content better, and that's going to work. But if they get 1 million people to go, hey, we got a podcast at iTunes, click here to listen, that's legit and that's real, and that should chart.
Yeah, that's one of the things when I was looking around at some of the articles today. A lot of these companies, well, let's say all of them that I read into, they promise that you'll chart, and they promise that you'll be this high up on the charts, or this or that. None of them talk about actual listeners. It's all about just getting your placement on the chart itself.
Well, all the research I've done, they have a playbook that they play from, and then what they claim is, especially those guys who were doing the $5,000 a week thing a little while ago, they claim that they have an exhaustive list of podcast fanatics who want to hear about your show. You know, and they have so many people interested in podcasting. I had one guy tell me he did it, and he said, yeah, apparently these guys are really big in the whole conservative radio world. And just by introducing me to all the conservative radio listeners, I can get to #1 for the finance topic. I mean, no, that's not real. So they have a playbook they play from, and they say that, you know, and they say it's real rankings, it's real people, it's real downloads. You know, nobody's going to, we're hacking the system. And I think some of them are actually probably, what I really want to find out is like, where's the center of all this? I know everybody's kind of reselling somebody else, and I want to kind of get down to, you know, who patient zero is on this. So I believe some of the guys actually believe that's it. But every case, I've tracked 5 different instances, and every single time from 5 different providers, every single time, no change in downloads at all. And I worked with podcast hosting companies to verify this issue. And no change in downloads, just subscribes. That's it.
Anthony, you kind of hinted at that there are either sites or some type of some type of thing that's giving a better idea of tracking, like what's popular or introducing. I don't know. I feel like we might have brought it up before. I thought Chartable was that kind of that thing. Is that what Chartable? No, isn't
Chartable is just using the Apple Podcast data.
Okay. Yeah. But Anthony, do you remember, I'm referring back poorly, but do you remember you talked about
the IMDb type thing?
Yeah, the IMDb. Yeah. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, is it Podchaser? I think.
Yeah, Podchaser. That's the one. That's the one.
Yep. And there's another one, and it's, if you can, taking on the task of indexing the podcast world is such a daunting task to start off with. I applaud anyone willing to try it.
I think Blueberry seems to have a decent grip on this. I think Todd is pretty. I think he has more than what's in Apple. I mean,
yeah, and that's being a provider, as opposed to, you know, IMDb doesn't serve you movies, even though they're part of Amazon. But, you know, if you can be this neutral body that just wants to index and show links and things like that, that's an astronomical detail to try to do. And I think if we can get a service or two, preferably at least 2, that can do this effectively, I think that can be a huge resource as content producers, as listeners, as marketing professionals. Like there's so much there. If you can make those links, if you can get that data to line up and see who all does what, and you have a central repository for it, I think that would be amazing and really push really raise the tide, as it were, for everyone involved, just because there's so many other ways that you can view that data and construe it to how you need to see to grow or to capture your audience.
I think that's where PodTrack is positioning themselves with that.
Podchaser or PodTrack?
No, PodTrack.
Okay.
But with PodTrack, since they are able to track the downloads and they can say this podcast has the most downloads, it's only those who have opted in to use PodTrack. Right. And even if Blueberry or Libsyn were to do the same, then it would be only those who opted in to use those services. But reason
Blueberry tracks without, you don't have to be on Blueberry. Doesn't Todd try to?
You do have to. Well, Blueberry has.
No, I mean in terms of Todd's directory, you don't have to be on Blueberry to be in his directory.
Right. But that doesn't necessarily track how popular the podcast is.
No, I'm saying just in terms of capturing as all the podcasts. I think Todd has podcasts that don't exist in iTunes. Like most places are just pulling the iTunes library, right? What I think Todd has more than that.
Well, Google has like 3 million in their directories.
Yes,
so.
Google they're blowing everyone out of the water. They
this
have
is Google's business, so this is what they do. So they should be able to.
They should, but they don't. They're learning.
I suspect that number is down to 1 million.
So I guess I'm saying, because I'm thinking, oh yeah, who's going to use the power users are going. This is the site the power users use, right? But I mean, Anthony, you said producers great for content creators, marketers, like you said. What else? What is happening? What's your vision? Say there's an independent site that has pretty much captured all RSS feeds, so it actually is a podcast. It's not just on YouTube. And what are they doing? What would you hope that they would do with that?
For me, the ideal solution wouldn't just be capturing the feeds; it'd be capturing all the metadata along with it. Who's been on the shows, what guests they've had, what other shows are linked in. So you can look at say a podcaster like Tom Merritt. You can see, okay, well, he did Buzz Out Loud for these years here with these other people associated, and then he went over to the Twit Network and did these shows with these people. Then he went independent. Now he's doing and you can kind of follow that tree down and see, not necessarily the Venn diagram, but the ancestry of Tom's podcast career and see what else is related. Well, he's done 4 shows with Scott Johnson, so those two I might want to look into more things that Scott's done because those are likely to be related, and kind of see how that's going through. Kind of like almost how LinkedIn does relationships with people. Like you can see a list of people and it tells you how many generations away from that person you are. Oh, I'm only 3 people away from this guy here, and he does. I admire him because of the work he did here. Well, then you can try to make those connections, and something that can bring that to light, not just the RSS feeds themselves, but a lot of that metadata that can really be used to give you a visualization of other things you might be interested in, topics, content producers, hosts, that kind of thing, networks. I think that's really, as far as not worrying about the numbers per se, but worrying about the stuff within the podcast. That might be where the next horizon could be.
Cool. You guys want to see something like that? I mean, Podchaser is doing. I think they're doing a good job of like figuring out where someone has been. Like, isn't it? I've never even gone over there yet, but I keep hearing people mention things about it. It's like, oh, I didn't even remember I was on that podcast, but it shows it there.
Well, I think things like that are neat. The IMDb of podcasts. You're taking a decentralized ecosystem and trying to centralize it. And it just doesn't seem to be working very well.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's harm, but tracking it as best as you can, right? I mean, that's kind of what they're trying to do, right? Trying to give us a picture by tracking it as much as possible. But
I can't tell you how many TV shows or movies I've found by looking on IMDb and seeing other things that these people are involved in and being, oh, hey, let me check that out. And it turns out to be a really good movie because, some of the same people are involved.
But see, it's a different evolution with IMDb and movies. Movies are, I would say they're not, I'd say movies are centralized in their distribution. You see a movie either in the theater, you see it now through some kind of streaming service, or you see it on disc or purchase it in some way. It's very simple, very small, centralized system. And sites like IMDb got popular because movies were around decades before the internet was around. And so then the internet comes along, it starts to solve some of these problems and starts to create these databases of movies. Whereas with podcasts, databases existed and the internet, the web existed before podcasts. And it's just so much of a different medium. It's kind of like, why don't we have an IMDb of blogs out there? Now, maybe someone somewhere in the blogging industry has tried to create that, but it's trying to solve a problem I think the audience is not necessarily looking for. Now, what they could do for other content creators, I think that's their ideal audience, to find ways that they can serve the industry the creators in the industry by either tracking certain analytics for people or by showing relationships between different podcasts and such. That could be helpful, I think, more to the podcasters, less to the audience.
Well, see, I don't use IMDb unless I'm trying to figure out who a person is, or I'm like, where have I seen them before? So I'm curious, because I doubt, why is IMDb popular? What do you think it's used for most? Who uses it? Like, you know what I mean? What's really going on? I don't think it's a thing that people go to en masse to find what movie they want to see next. I never even thought of it that way. I just always, for me, it's just like it lists out a person's career in acting industry.
Well, I can only speak for my household, of course, but we have two types of IMDbers in our family. We have me, who looks at it as a reference. Oh, well, what else has this person been in, so I can go watch that. And then you have pretty much the rest of my family, who is the, oh, I'm seeing this and I know that person. Let me find out who they are. Oh, and then let me go back and, I've seen them in this and this and this. And they sit there and have a discussion about it. And it's all based on the information in IMDb. It's more of an external thing, where for me, it's internal. Like I just want to see what else. But that's where I think it could really link in. So if you had not a comprehensive, because I think that, not exhaustive, because I think that'd be impossible for podcasts because there's just so many of them. But if you had a 50% solution on podcasts in that same kind of format, and then say Overcast linked into it, so you're listening to a show and you swipe left, right, up, down, whatever it is for that particular app, and it shows you here's a link to this, this host or this guest or whatever, and you tap on it and it brings up a list of other things that they've been in. Especially like in tech news, there's certain personalities that float around and you see them all the time. But what else have they been in? What other episodes have they been in? You can go in there and tap, this person's name, Joe Smith. Oh, he's been in these podcasts right here. I can go and find out exactly what episodes they've been in. I think that as a podcast listener would be great for me, but I just might be that type of personality.
Well, I think the key there is what you said, is that an app is integrating this tech, because no site that does any of these things gets used in mass, I don't think, right? It's like the power users will use, but if it's plugged into from other sites, because now we're just going back to we're going back to the original idea of, we need these apps that already have our attention to then turn us on to other stuff, right? And I think in that way it's good, because a lot of times we say with podcasting, hey, they come for the content and they stay for the host, right? So it would be cool to see, oh, hey, I also, I want to see what else this person is in, and you are more likely, because you like that person, to follow over there. So in that way, then I think it goes back to, what problem are we solving? There's a problem that doesn't exist. So there's a problem where, maybe there's a problem. Rob would say there is not, that things are not showing me new stuff, I guess.
It basically just circles around discoverability. We want better discoverability.
I was going to say, I hesitate to use the word discoverability, but it is discovery. I mean, okay.
Let me fall on that knife for you then.
Yeah, there you go. Paul, do you think we have, dare I even bring it up? But, Rob's not here. I think Rob seems to be the lone warrior here, and Rob's right about a lot of things. Would you like to see better discoverability, whatever that means to you?
Yes.
All right.
I'd like to see it for the non-nerds. Yeah. I think Tom Webster calls them, the 54. The people who don't know. Is
that a percentage? What's the 54?
Yeah, I think it's like the 54% who has never listened to a podcast or something. It's some number he had. But remember, those of us who are in the know, we're entirely different than the people who aren't.
Yes.
And discoverability for those who aren't, is an entirely different world. And that's where I think our next audience comes from. My future is not getting, you all to listen to another show. My future is to introduce your show to another demographic. I'm doing an event next week where we're launching the podcast of a gal who's 84. And she's got a room of about 300 people in the audience. And I'm going to predict that of the 300, 50 of them listen to podcasts. We're going to introduce podcast to 250 people. And in the back of the room, we're going to have tech support, like bring your phone, because statistically speaking, they've got a phone that makes it possible. They're the ones where discoverability is an issue.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm going to wrap it up with the best tip that you're ever going to hear on the Roundtable, and that is to just go get yourself a Super Bowl ad, and your podcast will be discovered. So I've solved all the issues. We can wrap it up because they're not listening. Oh, anyways, all right. We are going to wrap it up. Let me know where we can let the audience know where they can find your podcast so they can discover you right here on the Roundtable, the best search discoverability search engine on the web podcast. Anthony, thanks for joining us for your first Roundtable. Always welcome back.
It is a pleasure being here. I'm glad to meet you guys on the chat, and it's a lot of fun. Cruise on over to ritualmisery.com and find all the things that I'm doing, and a lot of it is NSFW because, well, we don't care about getting those numbers that'll go up if we cut the cursing. So we have a good time. There's a lot of different topics on there, and it's a lot of fun. So come have some fun with us. Ritualmisery.com.
Awesome. Thanks. And Daniel, thanks again, co-hosting the Roundtable.
Check me out over at theaudacitytopodcast.com, where when I bring back content, it will be published over there, as well as announcements of something new coming.
Very cool. And Paul, thanks for jumping in late. Paul is Dave today, so he doesn't get counted to a t-shirt for Paul. Sorry, bud. Thanks for joining us. Where should we go? We already know.
The podcastreport.com.
That's right. See, very short like Dave. So you're doing your job. All right.
Do what I can.
Checks in the mail, buddy. That's it. Podcasters Roundtable 119. Go to podcastersroundtable.com/guest if you want to sign up. Bring you onto a roundtable, and we'll bring up one story, and then we'll talk about whatever we want, because that's what we do here in Roundtable. We split off. We have fun. Campfire conversation about podcasting. Wave goodbye. We're out of here. See ya.